Hey everybody, this is Jared with the Blue and Gray Education Society, and tonight we have one of my favorite people when it comes to Civil War, Chris Hartley. Um, and Chris has just put out another fantastic book. His first book, Stoneman's Raid, we did an interview on a while back, and he has followed that up with another piece that I feel is going to be the seminal work on this general, and that's D.H. Hill. But before we get to that, Chris, how are things going down in Carolina for you?
Thank you, Jared. Appreciate that kind introduction. I appreciate the support. Always good to see you and to be with the Blue and Gray Education Society. Things are good in North Carolina. We are ready for spring for sure. A little bit warmer weather so we can get out and tromp some battlefields again soon.
Absolutely, especially after we had a pretty rough few weeks there in January. I mean, it was,
Yeah,
the snow and the ice kind of cripple things for us in this part of the country. So it's nice to
absolutely.
see some warm weather, but you're right, it's
Mhm.
almost battlefield time. So, like I mentioned, Chris has just put out a new book on Daniel Harvey Hill. I've got a copy of it right here, and let me tell you, this is a fantastic read, and we're gonna dive into it some tonight. I don't want to give away too much because I still want everybody to go out and buy the book. But we'll dive more into your writing process, Chris, and more about
Yeah.
Daniel Harvey Hill, the man, Civil War, and kind of his legacy because. He's
Mhm.
a very much overlooked general in the grand scheme of the war, but that doesn't make him any less complex. In fact, I would argue one of the more complex generals, the
Yeah.
more you dive into him. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. What drew you to the life of Daniel Harvey Hill, and what made you decide that he deserved a full biography? Because this is actually, and you mentioned this in your introduction, this is the first cradle to grave biography of Daniel Harvey Hill that's ever been done, which is surprising. Here we are 160 years removed from the war, and no one's done a full life biography of Daniel Harvey Hill till now. So what first drew you to his life, and what made you decide this is the person I want to spend time researching?
Yeah, you really hit on it, Jared. He is a fascinating individual that deserves the deep study. He was at the center of some of the most controversial moments during the Civil War. He was involved in the infamous Lost Order or Lost Dispatch controversy in the Maryland campaign. He was involved in the Chickamauga or the post Chickamauga generals revolt, some term it, in terms of a bunch of generals trying to get rid of Braxton Bragg from command of the Army of Tennessee. He was involved in kind of some debates during the Gettysburg campaign with Robert E. Lee over reinforcements, trying to keep reinforcements away from Lee to defend other parts of the South while Lee was amassing his force to march into Pennsylvania ultimately. Um, but fascinating for so many other reasons. He's a consummate Southerner. He's a brother-in-law of Stonewall Jackson. He's a professor, a mathematics professor. He's an author, a religious scholar. After the war, he becomes a magazine publisher, newspaper editor, goes on to lead a couple of different colleges in the South and really goes on to mold generations of Southern students and at the same time contributed mightily to what's known as the Lost Cause movement in the way he tried to preserve Confederate history and Confederate memory after the Civil War. So a man of a long life and a lot of very passionate opinions, shall we say, makes him worthy of a full-length biography for sure.
Oh, absolutely. In your previous work on Stoneman's Raid, you were following a campaign, and we talked about last time. It was a lot of
Mhm.
Stoneman's men were here on this day and they did this, and you kind of follow them day by day and area by area. What is different between researching that and researching a biography that's meant to tell the story of one person as opposed to a one campaign?
Yeah. It's challenging, no question about it. So, you've got the full lifespan of an individual to really take advantage of, to study, to learn about. And whereas if you're studying a single campaign or a single battle, you certainly want to know the context of that battle and what's going on. This is the context of a lifetime. That this is our, various historical periods that this individual lived through, and you really have to understand the life and times of this person from beginning to end, right? What was it like when this individual was born? What was life like? What was going on in the area he lived in, the area around him, the United States, the world, and really continue that study. So it's pretty challenging to try to amass all that and understand all that. And however imperfectly I achieved that, it was also a delight to do, to understand so many different nuances of American history, to see his participation and his journey from childhood in South Carolina to West Point, to serving in the Mexican War and the pre-war army, those struggles to becoming involved in as a college teacher in the pre-Civil War days, the antebellum days, to fight during the war, and then to go on after the war in various pursuits of life, and really trying to put his life back together and make a living to support his family in the midst of Reconstruction. So it's really a different challenge and a different person every step of the way. I think about that sometimes for myself, at my age, sometimes I look back and think, wow, I'm a little bit different than I was at 20 years old now. Learned a few things along the way, and sometimes the hard way. But I'm certainly a different person now than I was then, and there are reasons for that. And it's also trying to understand the journey that someone else went through, um, based on the resources we have available to do that. So it presents a series of challenges, but also pretty fun puzzles.
And one advantage that you would have with Daniel Harvey Hill is he left behind a lot of writings, and
Yeah.
and he didn't seem to hold much back in those writings. So, besides that, what other sources were you able to use and kind of gain a picture of who he was?
hmm Yeah, you're absolutely right. He wrote must have been millions of words in his lifetime, and I felt like I read every single one of them along the way. So that was really critical in piecing this together. It's also, the words of his contemporaries. It's looking at the records that he left behind him, both as a student, as a professor, as a college president, as a businessman, a publication editor, and owner. So business records and publication records and student records are certainly part of that. The articles he wrote, he was an amazing writer. He wrote a lot of different topics, everything from religion to algebra, famous algebra textbook, to articles about the criticizing the United States government, the United States military during the Mexican War as a young soldier. So it's digging up those original newspaper resources and seeing what he wrote during the Mexican War. It's looking after the Civil War at newspaper articles he wrote then about religion or about uh, colleges and education. It's even delving into the publications that he edited after the war. Because he was the editor, he had a soapbox in some of the publications that he edited and wrote after the Civil War. So you can really glean a lot from what he believes and what he thinks, what he's dealing with from those editorials. And by the same token, some of the things that your viewers are certainly familiar with, like the Battles and Leaders series of the Civil War, originally a series of magazine articles for Century Magazine, a very popular publication in the post-war years, and Hill contributed a handful of articles to that. Um, and along the way, he wrote letters back and forth to the editors of that publication, giving them his feedback, his opinion about other articles that were being written, or debating with them about the accuracy of his own work. And so every one of those steps provide little pieces to the puzzle of who this man was and help us understand him a little bit better, as complex as he is.
And I know anybody who does research on the Civil War has already kind of formed opinions about each leader in their head, for better or for worse, and as opinions go, everybody's is different. But going into this, was your opinion of Daniel Harvey Hill changed, or did you learn anything along the way that would have surprised you or challenged the way that historians have typically viewed him in the 160 years since the war?
Yeah, for sure. When I entered this project, I probably had a viewpoint like most people. There are some legends, if you will, or tropes about Hill that have been published over the years, publicized, talked about. There's a trope that he was basically kicked out of the Army of Northern Virginia by Robert E. Lee. There's a legend that he was the guy that lost the infamous Lost Dispatch during the Maryland campaign, or that he was behind the officers' revolt that I mentioned earlier after the Chickamauga campaign. There's also even just conversations about Hill himself, because he was a super opinionated, very critical individual, and it's kind of accepted that he was that way because he had terrible health, and with his health situation, who wouldn't be grumpy with all that, right? So, and after studying the man for as long as I have, I feel like every single one of those are probably not correct, in my opinion, based on the evidence I saw. Um, my readers might disagree with me, but that's the fun of Civil War history and history in general is I'll present the evidence I found in my arguments, and we'll see what people think about that. But they seems to me like a lot of those things are just legends and not really factual.
Right. I know the injury piece is always a big part of it, just his general disdain for things and kind of
Yeah.
being standoffish because of his
Mm.
health. Uh, in writing this book, what were some of your biggest challenges? Was it just sorting through the massive amount of sources and having to digest all of those? Was it kind of interpreting his personality based off of letters, or did you find that something else was a great challenge?
Yeah, all the above. Just the amount of content that's out there was certainly daunting. Some of your viewers may be familiar with the Hal Bridges book about D.H. Hill that came out, and I believe it was 1961, early 60s. I mean, it's a good book, but he admits himself that there's so much D.H. Hill stuff out there that he decided not to do a full-length biography. He just wanted to focus on key parts of Hill's life, which is understandable, and he did it admirably. Um, but I felt like it was important to do, so I dove in and just gave it a whirl. That was certainly a challenge along the way. There's no question perspective and having corroboration is always important. There was more than one event that I came across that are that came from one resource, one person. There's no corroborating witness that said, yeah, it happened just the way this other person said. And you've always got to question that source if you only have one source that's claiming something that happened. A lot of times I left it in there because it's a pretty darn good story, but I did it with a question mark. We should take that with a grain of salt because there was no corroborating evidence to support this individual's claim. But a lot of it always supported the worldview of Hill that he was just such a critical guy that a lot of people didn't like, which isn't entirely true.
And diving more into Hill the man, it seems like depending on which source you read from his contemporaries, people either absolutely loved him or
Mhm.
absolutely hated him. There was not too many people who were just kind of on the fence about him.
Yeah.
So, do you think that his personality, as abrasive as it was, may have helped him as a commander, or did it ultimately hurt him in the end?
Yeah, he was sort of like the Dallas Cowboys of the Civil War, right? You either love him or you hate him, kind of a thing. Um, that was Hill, right? You either loved him or you hate him, and he certainly had a lot in both camps, for sure. So, and I think in many ways it did hurt him. It probably limited his use later in the Civil War because he was so combative and so critical. He had essentially a falling out with Jefferson Davis, where they failed to see eye to eye, and as a result, Hill was essentially on the shelf during a time period when the Confederacy sure could use a good general to help them win a few, on the battlefield in 1864 as those battles, across the South continued. It on the other hand, it also shows what a passionate guy he was. Um, One of the arguments I make in my book is that his harsh points of view have a lot to do with his upbringing and where he comes from as an individual, and it really showed how much he really loved something when he was willing to stand up and fight against something that he saw was improper or wrong. He would stand up and fight against it because he believed so passionately that it was wrong, and that was the way he had been raised. That was the way he had been taught. He didn't know any other way to do it. He was not a guy that just sailed through life He was a guy that if he saw something that was a problem, he did something about it.
Right. And I definitely agree with the 1864 piece. I mean, having him on the sidelines, that was definitely a hindrance. And I think most people would agree with that,
Yeah.
especially when the Confederacy needed anybody they could get that had a good backbone. But you speak about him being passionate, and we know Hill was the brother-in-law to Stonewall Jackson, who was, one of the most passionate people in the Civil War, but especially passionate when it came to religion. And Hill was supposedly the one who introduced him to the Presbyterian Church.
Hmm.
So, how much did Hill's faith shape his leadership style? And how much did it shape his worldview during the war, since he was so passionate about that piece?
Yeah, his faith shaped everything in his life. You know, God, God and Jesus Christ were absolutely center in his life. That doesn't mean he was perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We all know that how much he hated Yankees, and that's you don't see anything in the Bible about being permissive of hate. But that's something that he recognized was a big failing of his, yet he still did it. But nonetheless, it was something that shaped everything he did, from the way he lived, certainly to the places he served. He was always interested in serving at schools that had religious leanings. Washington College had some religious ties, but most of all, Davidson was a Presbyterian college, and he was really driven to take his teaching abilities when he left the Army, take his teaching abilities to a college that served Presbyterianism because he so much believed in it. There were times he even thought, even as he was serving during the Civil War, that, man, maybe I'll just give up uh, being a Confederate general and go serve God in some way. That seems like maybe what I'm being called to do. That didn't work out, but he certainly saw to the religious instruction of his men. There was no lack of preachers in his camps, or no lack of support for any uh, kind of effort towards helping his men become followers of Jesus, members of the church. That was so important to him everywhere he went. And yeah, and you can really see it shining through his kind of life. Everywhere he goes, everything he does, he tries to put God in the center as much as he can. I mean, he even writes books about religion. He wrote he wrote a book about the Sermon on the Mount. He wrote a book about the Gospels and the crucifixion of Jesus, and how the crucifixion of Jesus is presented in the Gospels. It's pretty fascinating, kind of putting all that evidence together as presented in the Gospels. So, um, smaller articles about religion as well that are pretty interesting. So, he was a Christian through and through. I think one writer. Um, it escapes me off the top of my head. One of our famous writers, it might have been Freeman, Douglas Sala Freeman, who said this, but basically he said he loved God as much as he hated Yankees, and that's a pretty good way to sum him up. So,
That's that's a pretty awesome quote. And then thinking about it, you know, he toyed with the idea of leaving the war to serve the church. He could have pulled a reverse Polk,
you're right.
so,
Yeah.
so with Hill being a professor and educator before the war, how did that shape his views about like leadership and his approach towards the towards fighting?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm not sure his educational philosophies really came into play as much in warfare as his West Point training and his Mexico experience did. Certainly, one thing that he did as he came up through the ranks of education is he maintained a lot of relationships with former soldiers. His West Point connections, if you will, remained very strong for him throughout his career, either before or after the war. And so, in many ways, that continued to influence him each and every day. The other piece that I think you could call out is how how important discipline was to him as both a teacher and a soldier. He believed deeply in the West Point philosophy of a disciplined education system with a system of demerits that kept soldiers in line and, taught them how to behave properly and, well, and, march around and have the right decorum and everything. He carried that through into his philosophy as a commander, and was pretty well known for running a tight ship with his troops. Anytime he had straggling, it drove him nuts to no end. He hated that, and he generally kept his men very well in hand, kept them very well fed, kept them very well taken care of. Some of the ranks may not have agreed with that statement I just made, by the way, but if you look at the records, it generally does support the fact that he tried to keep a tight ship in everything he did. And that's probably a key way that his educational background carried through into his military career.
Well, being a graduate of VMI myself, I can speak to the
Yeah.
positive things of having the merits and marching around in tight circles and stuff like that. Yeah, I spent 4 years of that and can attest that that is
Yeah.
it's definitely shaped my life even to this day.
Well, one day, Jared, will look up your records of demerits like I did for Hill. So,
Uh, good luck. That's a you'll have a lot of source material there as well. Um, so you mentioned that Hill kind of fell out with Jefferson Davis, and he was part of kind of the mutiny against Bragg there after Chickamauga. That's one of the things that people remember most about Hill is his strong criticism of Confederate leadership. Do
Mhm.
you think he was justified in those criticisms, or did they cost him opportunities in the end?
Yeah, I think Hill had justification. What it really boiled down to was when Hill was relieved of command after Chickamauga, he asked for charges to be preferred. He asked for evidence. Why he needed to know, why did you relieve me of command? I need to know and understand so I can defend myself. When nothing was forthcoming to say, here's exactly what you did wrong, his basic reply was, okay, then if you'll give me a letter, I'll call it a letter of recommendation or a letter of support that says that I really didn't do anything wrong in Chickamauga and that you're trustworthy, then I'm good to go back to work for the Confederate Army. He'll believe strongly that that kind of vote of confidence, as you will, if you will, from the Confederate government was necessary. Otherwise, he was afraid that the troops would not follow him because they'd say, "Well, he got fired at Chickamauga. Why are you making him my commander now?" And I think he's probably reasonably justified for that. Where he fell short, though, is that he was too stubborn to ever give up on that idea. Time passed. He remained on the shelf. Um, Nobody took the high road, essentially. Jefferson Davis certainly didn't. Hill did not. There was nobody who could really intervene, even though Confederate congressmen tried to try to get him back to work. And finally, after way too long of a period, he ended up just back in a command. Um, there was nothing else to do, but it took way too long for that to happen. A lot of stubbornness.
Right. And it's one thing I noticed while reading this is, he carried that passion piece into his opinions to the point, where he was willing to die on the hills that he built.
Yeah,
Um,
good way to put it. Yeah.
so while admirable in one sense as a general, when it comes to chain of command and hierarchy, that's not necessarily the hill that you want to be on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There were numerous chances for both parties to give a little. Neither budged until it was really too late for him to do much good in any kind of command role that was remaining in the Confederacy at the time. So,
Right. Yeah. Diving more into his role in the Civil War specifically, you mentioned that he was a key component in the Antietam campaign and the Gettysburg campaign. Where do you think his military abilities were most clearly demonstrated?
yeah, I think there's certainly a high watermark, if you will, to use an overused term from Civil War. Um, Really, you could argue there are two of them. One is Seven Pines. It's a battle we don't talk much a whole lot, kind of before the 7 days and everything, but It was a major battle, one of the biggest battles ever fought at the time. And Hill played a huge role in leading the offensive on the first day on the Confederate right flank up the Williamsburg Road, the last day of May of 1862, and was very successful. Broke through a couple of very strong Yankee lines, captured tents and equipment and soldiers, and all but threatened that flank of the Army of the Potomac at the time. Um, so that was a kind of a seminal moment for him. And I would follow that up to his day at South Mountain. Um, Probably Antietam as well. Longstreet himself there was no more obstinate fighter in the whole Confederacy than D.H. Hill, and he proved it on South Mountain and in Antietam. The struggle to hold South Mountain against overwhelming forces, the struggle in the Bloody Lane against those massive attacks from Federal soldiers, just incredible stories of bravery, of tenacity, of refusing to budge. It's a theory that we just talked about, right? He certainly did that on the battlefield too. He refused to budge, and um, he was the immovable object in both of those situations. With up until the very end of the Antietam battle, where he finally had to fall back out of the Bloody Lane for a lot of complicated reasons, but. Certainly marks of what a tenacious battlefield commander and solid battlefield commander he really is in both of those instances.
And with Antietam and then later with Gettysburg, he had a one-on-one working relationship with Robert E. Lee, and hundreds of biographies have been written on Lee, and a lot of them probably touch on his relationship with Hill from the Lee standpoint. But
Yeah,
what do you feel is Hill's relationship with Lee coming from Hill's standpoint?
yeah. Yeah, Hill himself once said that I am not so enamored of General Lee as many other people might be. Um, he did not believe that. Well, let me back up. Hill did admire Robert E. Lee's military abilities. There's no question about that. But there were times when they disagreed on strategy. They disagreed on situations. It was started as early as the days before Malvern Hill, or the hours before the Battle of Malvern Hill, where Hill basically made a recommendation that we should not attack that strong federal position, and Lee ignored his recommendation. Longstreet all but laughed at him. And we know what happened there. The Confederate Army proceeded to attack um, McClellan's massed artillery up on Malvern Hill and were decimated as a result of that. Um, that was really the beginning of a contentious relationship between Hill and Lee, where they didn't always see eye to eye. Hill didn't think much of Lee's strategy in the Maryland campaign. He thought that dividing the Confederate forces as they crossed the Potomac River and headed in different directions was crazy. He thought Lee's invasion into Gettysburg, into Pennsylvania, was silly. Um, all of those gave Hill reason to question Lee. He still admired him as a general, but recognized that sometimes he didn't necessarily make the best military decisions in Hill's view. Um, you know, that being said, in Lee's credit, Lee admired Hill to a point. He knew how to work with him. He recognized that Hill was a super fighter and a good guy to have on your side. Now there would be problems. He was one of those guys that is always seems to always be getting into some issue, some argument, or what have you, and that Lee had to step in from time to time. But he kept doing it because he felt it was important to keep that general on his team. The there was an example of that took place not long before Hill departed from the Army of Northern Virginia, where Hill got into a shouting match, so to speak, with the War Department in Richmond on a couple of different issues. Lee stood up for him, and this was right in the days that a lot of people are saying that Lee was getting rid of Hill from the Army of Northern Virginia. If that's the case, why is Lee even bothered to stand up for Hill? Nothing could have been further from the truth. And it was Hill that resigned from the Army of Northern Virginia and left. Lee wanted him to stay, and so did Stonewall Jackson. But Hill was in poor health, declining health, and was probably a little bit kind of had lost um, his respect for where the Army of Northern Virginia was going and how it was handled, and was ready to move on. But he thought it was time for him to leave.
And speaking of his strained relationships with Richmond, we touched briefly about on his relationship with Jefferson Davis. How do you feel that the internal politics of that impacted his rise and then later his fall throughout the course of the war?
Yeah, it had a tremendous impact, and it really traced to the early days of the war. Um, Hill was really responsible for one of the Confederacy's first victories, the Battle of Bethel, that took place in 1861. Um, and that first victory that really made him one of the early heroes of the Confederacy, certainly in the state of North Carolina, but in the Confederacy overall. Yet, when the Confederacy first published its first list of leading generals, Hill's name was nowhere to be seen on that. He took a look at that list and he saw other generals that had fought fewer battles than him and had done less for the Confederacy. John Pemberton being an example of that, a name on that list, and Hill was surprised that he was not on that list. So early on, he started to feel like the government in Richmond was not necessarily treating him as he would have expected, as he thought they should. He felt like that treatment continued off and on throughout the war, and it really soured his relationship toward the Confederate government throughout his service with the entire Confederate Army, where no matter where he was or where he was located, he always had a question in the back of his mind that he was being jerked around and really not being well thought of, no matter what was going on, what was happening, and that fueled his feud with Jefferson Davis, kind of bowled over, if you will. Um, at that point, it was just another example of how Hill was being mistreated by the Confederate government. He was told that there were no lieutenant general positions open after he had been basically let go from the Chickamauga campaign with that role. Yet it was kind of funny how John Bell Hood managed to get a lieutenant general's promotion at the same exact time. Hmm. Somebody's not telling me the full story here if that's going on. So he had good reason to think the way he did. The Confederate government did not handle him as properly as they should have.
All right, let's play a dangerous game here and ask a what if question. Some historians, you know, feel that Hill never fully reached the level of responsibility
Mm,
that his abilities deserved. Do you think he was underutilized, and where would you have placed him
mm.
after Chickamauga for
Yeah.
the most successful place for him after Chickamauga?
Yeah, I do think that Hill was worthy of corps command, um, but I also think that he was the kind of leader who needed to work as part of a solid team. Um, he had the benefits of doing that with the Army of Northern Virginia as a corps commander. Um, he did not end under Braxton Bragg in the Army of Tennessee. Bragg was just not the right kind of leader to get the most out of a D.H. Hill, unfortunately. And I think we can say that about Bragg in a lot of cases. You ask a really difficult question, though. Where could he have fit? One of the things that I find intriguing is simply around the question of being a lieutenant general. What happened to Hill? He was made a temporary lieutenant general until the Confederate Congress could return to session and confirm his rise to that rank. Um, Hill was told, well, there are no open positions for being a lieutenant general, um, so we cannot put your name back in front of Congress for confirmation. Untrue, because there are actually lieutenant generals serving as department commanders in other parts of the Confederacy. Um, Kind of a strange argument to make when you could easily look at the roster and say, well, what about this guy over here, right? He's a lieutenant general. Um, I think they could easily have returned Hill to department command um, at the rank that he deserved and he had earned, and he would have been a contributor. I don't think he would have returned to the Army of Northern Virginia, although that would have been a natural place for him to go, and probably a place where his service was a bit better utilized because he needed a strong leader like a Robert E. Lee to develop him. Um, at the end of the day, there weren't many places left where he could have gone, but just the fact that they did not honor him by um, allowing him to go to that lieutenant general rank I think irked him to no end and really robbed the Confederacy of his services at the end of the day.
And you mentioned, you know, the Confederacy honoring him and kind of doing him dirty towards the end.
Yeah.
Because he was not one to play the politics game. So when people think of Confederate generals, especially ones who are worthy of corps commands, some top names like
Mhm.
Jackson, Longstreet pop up. But where do you think Hill falls in the rank of Confederate generals when it comes to legacy?
Yeah, I always think a better option is to ask those who were there. And I look straight at Joseph E. Johnston. Joseph E. Johnston said D.H. Hill was among the best division and corps commanders the Confederacy ever had. Um, there are some that question Joseph E. Johnston as a leader himself, but I think his judgment in this case is absolutely correct. I do think he'll have the ability to be a solid corps commander given the right situation. It's unfortunate for him and the Confederacy that that right situation did not exist when the when the time came about for him to be in that position. But I do think he was talented enough to be in that position for sure. I don't think he could have risen higher over than Corps Command. In fact, I don't think he wanted to rise any higher than Corps Command. He never had a desire to lead a larger force than a corps or an army, for sure. So even though he was blamed by some folks after the war for that, that was not the case. He was never interested in that.
Moving on from the war to Hill's life after the war. Um, what do you find most interesting about post-war Daniel Harvey Hill? Was it the um, educational aspect? Was it the religious aspect? Or was there something about his life that people would find intriguing that we haven't already talked about?
Yeah, I think one really important piece to keep in mind is what a role he played in the quote unquote lost cause movement. Um, and essentially it's the name for how Confederate memory developed, how those who were Confederate veterans tried to shape the memory of their wartime contributions. There certainly were lost causers, if you will, who tried to put the Confederacy on a on a pedestal, um, and talk about how the Confederacy only lost because of resources, or the Ulysses S. Grant had more troops and so on and so forth. But Hill had a different brand of lost cause message. Um, Hill never really, um, for obvious reasons, was not one to put the Confederate government on a pedestal. He was not one to put other leaders on a pedestal. The one he put on the pedestal was the individual Confederate soldier. He thought, pound for pound, there was no better soldier in the history of the world than the Confederate soldier. And he presented argument after argument, evidence after evidence of the, how successful the Confederate soldier was on battlefields. That was his lost cause. That was what he was the message he was trying to get across is what, what amazing fighters the Confederate soldier really, really was. And that was his lost cause. He really worked to get that message across in a couple of ways. He published one of the very first Confederate pieces of Confederate literature. It was called The Land We Love. It was a magazine, Charlotte, North Carolina's first magazine, in fact, published right after the Civil War. Hill created it. He in doing so, he printed it only on Southern paper. He hired for his staff only employees who were born in the South. He only employed writers from the South. It was a pretty Southern enterprise, if you will. It's no wonder he called it the land we love. But in its pages, not only will you find fiction and poetry and feature stories, but you'll also find a lot of Confederate history, battle reports, and contributions from veterans, and stories of the war, even some of Hill's memories himself around some particular events. It's a fascinating um, series of publications that Hill led. And then, of course, later he goes on and contributes mightily to the Battles and Leaders series that I think a lot of us are familiar with today, that Century Magazine published and later became a series of, five or so books that you can get today that have article after article by leading participants of the war. Pretty fascinating series that Hill was a major contributor to. And both of those really are major contributions that Hill made, and they bookend his educational career. That's the other piece that I think is really fascinating is how Hill really spent more of his life as an educator than he did as a soldier. Um, and his contributions in the classroom and in leading universities helped mold generations of Southern students who went on to contribute to the growth of the South in the days after the Civil War. So that by itself is probably just as impactful as anything he ever did on a Civil War battlefield.
And I think I greatly appreciate diving into his lost cause, you know,
Mhm.
pieces because especially here where I live in Southern Virginia, Jubal
Mhm.
Early is one of the the big names. I mean
Yeah,
his his uh
indeed.
his childhood home is half an hour up the road from me. I'm
Yeah.
actually a mile and a half as the crow flies from his aunt and uncle's
Mm.
house.
Yeah.
It's right here behind me, but that's a huge name in the lost cause movement and
Mm.
tied to this area. But I think it's great what you said about Hill. He didn't elevate necessarily the Confederacy on a pedestal, but
Mm.
just the individual efforts of the soldiers, which often gets
Mhm.
lost when we talk about the heroes
Mhm.
of battles and the heroes of campaigns, and
Mhm.
focusing on one or two individual people. You lose
Mhm.
sight of the fact that what a lot of individual Confederate soldiers did. The people who lived
Yeah.
in our backyards, their contributions were extremely unheard of to that point. I mean, they were doing things that armies throughout the course of history had never done before,
Correct.
and
Yeah.
they were doing it all across battlefields here in the South, and
Mm.
that's definitely a good point to mention. So after spending so much time diving into Hill's life, and this, no doubt took years and years to complete this full picture of him, what do you think that modern readers will find the most compelling about Hill's life, Hill's legacy, something
Mhm.
that people who have heard of Hill their whole lives can take away? What's something that is new to this story you feel?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, and I've been kind of thinking about it a little bit. And I think one of the things that really jumps out to me at about this Civil War soldier, this Southerner, is the passion in which he lived his life. Um, you know, it's so easy sometimes to sail through life, even today, and not take a minute to, smell the roses or not work very hard or, whatever endeavor you might be associated with just to just kind of float through life, right? D.H. Hill never did that. D.H. Hill did everything he did, whether he was a soldier or a teacher or an author or a parent or a husband, or a Christian. He did everything he did with passion, um, and as hard as he knew how. He whether he was in a classroom or on a battlefield, he fought for what he believed in. He was not afraid to stand up for whatever he believed in, whether or not we believe today what he stood for was right or wrong. The point is that he did so with great passion. And I think that's an admirable trait, one that I certainly can learn from in my life, right? Is making sure I don't mail it in anything I do in life. That's D.H. Hill never did that, and I think that's really a lesson for all of us to take away. He was indeed quite the passionate soul throughout his life, no matter what he did.
Oh, absolutely. And kind of wrapping up this interview on a personal note, you know, as far as historians and researchers go, you've probably researched Hill more in depth than probably anybody out there, or at least as in depth as anybody out there. So, how do you personally remember Daniel Harvey Hill? A soldier, critic, Christian, or something else entirely?
I think probably the first thing that comes to my mind is as a husband and a father. Um, One of the things that that really shine through in everything he does is how much he loves his wife and how much he loves his children. His Civil War letters, many of them are at Carlisle Barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, U.S. Army History Education Center, are just full of questions to his wife, admonitions to his wife. How are you doing? Have you done so and so? Is there anything I can do to help you? Right? Have you thought about this? I mean, there is just so much passion. He could have spent page after page writing about a battle or some other, his day in the camp or whatever. And he certainly does some of that, which I'm glad of. But he spends a lot of time worrying about his family and caring for his family. So he's as much of a father and a family man as anything that we see him and think of him as. And of course, that's another thing that we can all learn from.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one final note, and we can edit this out if it's not quite ready for it to be discussed yet. You know, you spent years researching this book, and like it's phenomenal work. It's going to be the seminal piece, I think, on Daniel Harvey
Thank you.
Hill. So what's next
Yeah.
for Chris Hartley?
Well, well, as an author, I have a lot of areas, subject areas that I'm interested in. I'm actually working on a World War II project next. This will be my second World War II project. And it is a story about the Carolina maneuvers that took place in 1941. It's something that a lot of people don't know about, but on the eve of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army sent almost 400,000 soldiers into North and South Carolina to practice war. Soldiers like George Patton and Mark Clark and Hap Arnold were in the Carolinas getting the U.S. Army ready, and these maneuvers wound down just a few days before Pearl Harbor hit. So it was really the U.S. Army's last dress rehearsal before World War II. Pretty fascinating period and kind of the last practice, if you will, before the curtain dropped.
Well, that's awesome. Even though it's not Civil War related,
Yeah,
I'll definitely have to have you back on when that comes out because that's
yeah.
fascinating to me because like that's
Hmm.
almost in my backyard. That's in your backyard.
Well,
Um,
and what I love about it is, we think about the Carolinas campaign. You know a lot about Sherman and how he his troops kind of marched from Savannah up into North Carolina. This is essentially the same ground where Sherman marched, and this is the you can even call it the biggest battle ever fought in North and South Carolina, even though a live bullet wasn't ever fired. So,
Well, Chris, we thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. We will link um, the way to buy this book from Savis Beatty in the description below. And we were talking about this before we got rolling. Savis Beatty is now doing ebooks, so now you can listen to books just like you would on Audible with Amazon or any other places. Because I know that's how many people consume books now is by
mhm.
listening even when they're driving or mowing grass,
Mhm.
like we talked about. So you can either buy this hard copy to add to your library, or you can buy a digital copy. But we'll link that below. Chris,
Okay.
thank you so much for coming on and highly encourage you to go out and buy this book. Any final thoughts tonight?
No, Jerry, just appreciate the time. Always enjoyed chatting with you and all that you do for Blue and Gray. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we'll see you all guys next time.
All right. Thank you.